In this screencast, we'll be reviewing the Westernized notes for day 1. Remember, Westernized is a reference to the video that we will be watching in class. We'll be getting to that later. For the most part, here's where we are at with the race section. We finished looking at slavery as well as the African American experience, the political stalemate that leads to the Civil War, and now we are starting to look at Asian migration. We're going to first be looking at the Chinese and how the United States needed to build the Transcontinental Railroad, which linked the East to the West Coast. And in order to achieve this goal, they attracted labor from China, and that's where our focus is going to be present at. Move down, we already looked at the racial theories behind Down and the way he viewed people from Asia. We looked at the racial theories in the 1800s. And when we're looking here at the Chinese American question, the Chinese American question is really going to be how the country is going to deal with this particular issue of the influx of Chinese migrants to the United States, who are primarily coming here for work. When we're looking at this source here, we're seeing some of the racial theories. Here we see the use of this term, the Blumenbach use of yellow, the color as a race. And we see some other information here that doesn't seem to be a positive view of the Chinese or the yellow race, as they say. It's really the goal here. If we look at this particular section here, looking at the blood being depraved, debased, and this is the racial theory that is really going to prompt some of the legislation that is going to take place in the United States. Here we're looking at some of that labor. As I said before, Chinese labor was definitely used, as was other racial groups. I believe on this slide, they look at the difference between people from Ireland as well as people from China and how much they are being paid. Here it talks about the Irishman being paid $35 and the Chinese wage was $27. And again, that was really to build this transcontinental railroad, which is what we see going on in this particular photograph. Manual labor used to develop the transcontinental railroad. This link will take you to a visual from the documentary America's Story of Us. And I just want to recap that we did look at this in the gender section. This comes from the book Relations of Rescue, when we looked at the influx of Chinese women and how Chinese women were viewed as threats to white Puritan women values and the Protestant church and the role trying to assimilate Chinese women to Puritan middle class values. This is the video section that we're going to be looking at, and the video is pretty much going to look at women who are going through eye surgery to deal with the epicanthic fold and try to look more Western. These clips will take you to some of those sources. And here we see another individual. I know that's kind of a jump from where we were before looking at the historical, but when you look at these particular links, it's really going to be looking at how the Asian person views themselves. And then I just threw this situation in here because this guy Ali London, who believes he was Korean at some point, and I think the term was transracial. But again, it's all about identity, which brings us back to the double consciousness that we looked at from W.E.B. Du Bois during the section where we looked at the early 1900s and the fight to end segregation, and what he's talking about here with double consciousness. You have America. This could be any American citizen, but when you are a African American, it's almost like you are on two paths and you have two identities. And that two identities comes from how society views you. Well, if this is true for African Americans, you probably can then look at that from somebody who is a Korean American because their experience is going to be different, but there will be some more similar prejudicial and discrimination patterns that are similar, and then they would be on a separate path. It's all about having these two identities of yourself based on the way society views you. And we talked about this before. And in this example here, Du Bois is talking about being an African American and giving his card to this girl who refuses it. And in that moment, he comes to realize that there's one thing to be a white American, but then there's another thing to be a black American. When we watch the video Western Eyes, you're going to hear the story of the girl who is talking about what it means to be an American, but when she's in elementary school and she's told to use a yellow crayon, she comes to this understanding of her separate identity, that there are two Americas within the one that she is supposed to be a part of. Either classwork or homework, you're going to have to click this link and look at this reading. And in this reading, you're going to be looking at some of the 1800 laws that were passed in California. And remember, the Chinese are coming here to build that railroad. And then these are some of the laws that are designed to discriminate against these individuals. Let's see if we can find here. Non-whites cannot own land. Here, I think this is looking at interracial relationships. For the most part, you're going to come away with the understanding that Chinese Americans were definitely discriminated against, but in some of the language, you'll see the term Chinese, and then you'll see this M word here, and that could be a umbrella term. And what I mean by that is a term that's going to be used to, people from China, people from Japan, people from Korea. It's more of an umbrella term to describe all Asians. And you see some of that in the language where they're using words, phrases like non-whites, Chinese. Again, going back to some of the views of the Chinese in the United States. In this political cartoon, we see again the Chinese question. Here we see the Chinese migrant and the mob that's very upset with him. And this is really about labor. And all of these things here are reasons, possibly from this group here, that justifies their anger against this individual. And really, this is going to be about low pay. It's going to be about labor, less about the racial issue and more about the economic issue. In this slide, we see the San Francisco mayor. And if we just look at geography, we know that the Chinese are going to be on the West Coast. And trying to figure out how to bring up my pen again. Here we have the United States, and here we have Asia. And so there's going to be more Asian migration just as a result of geography. And that's why the San Francisco mayor, which is in California, is going to be upset. And in this reading here, he's looking at the difference between the Japanese and the Chinese, according to him. And according to him, he's arguing that the Chinese has a lower wage that they're willing to accept, whereas the Japanese are educated. And I think the main difference is that the Chinese is willing to work, be a laborer, whereas the Japanese wants to own the factories. And that's what makes the Japanese, according to this mayor, more threatening. That's why he's saying he wants to bar the Japanese, and he wants the Exclusion Act to include the Japanese, because it normally only included the Chinese. Here we see some more political cartoons. Notice the railroad in the back. And in this particular slide, what we're looking at here is, for the most part, the United States government is going to pass these exclusion acts, and these exclusion acts are going to restrict. Think of it like a funnel. All of the migrants are coming to the United States, but this funnel is not allowing anybody from China or anybody from Asia, if you're going to fall under that umbrella term for non-Chinese Asians using today's language. And that's what this political cartoon here is looking at. It's looking at the Exclusion Act and how it possibly has created a negative view of the United States. Here we see an additional political cartoon. We see the Chinese characters trying to go east, and notice how this newspaper has San Francisco, because again, they were traveling from the West Coast. All of this is going to lead to nativism. Coming back to this particular chart, we see the Asian migration here, starting primarily with the Chinese, and that's going to lead to nativism, people angry. They have more of a favoritism towards the natural born as opposed to the foreign born, and that's a little bit of what the Chinese are going to be subjected to. You're now going to click this link, which is going to take you to these immigration restriction laws. Now, if we're looking at this map here, we're seeing that they're trying to build that transcontinental railroad. The Chinese are now showing up, and then these laws are going to be passed, which are going to restrict Chinese migration. That's pretty much going to be the norm. It's not going to be until the 1960s where the United States government is going to remove some of those barriers that were designed to keep Asians out of the United States from migrating. And when you look at this particular file here, that's kind of what you get. All of these laws are targeting the Chinese or people from Asia. And that's why when you get to the 1920s, which is considered the boom for migration to the United States, you look at this chart here, we see that the Asian numbers are definitely low in comparison to people showing up from Europe, which there seems to be a whole bunch more in comparison. I mean, here we're comparing 11 million from Europe to 275,000 showing up from Asia. And that's it for this particular section. We'll now move on to the film, watching the episode of Sanford and Son, the Japanese